When she was younger, she was a little naive. She once read a story in a magazine about a woman who had married a gay man. After discovering his secret, the woman was devastated but eventually had a child through IVF. The story mentioned how she felt an unbearable desire when her child nursed from her breast. At the time, she didn't understand it at all. Wouldn't marrying a gay man be ideal? She thought. Staying a virgin from birth to death, preserving her purity while still having a husband and a child. What could be so terrible about that to cause such pain? Born in the early 1980s, she had grown up attaching great importance to the word purity before marriage. She looked down on sexual matters, considering them solely a means to have children. And indeed, that was how she handled it. She waited until after their engagement to sleep with him, doing so only to conceive a child. But unexpectedly, when her child turned a little over a year old, something in her awakened. Like him, she began to feel desire. And when they did it, she found it incredibly satisfying. The exhaustion of daily life seemed to vanish in that post-orgasmic serenity, leaving her in a good mood for the entire evening. They maintained a routine of intimacy 2 or 3 times a month, just enough. Although she had never been with another man, she thought her husband was great. He would take his time with foreplay, ensuring her body and mind were fully ready. Then, with a smooth motion, he would enter her, filling her completely. She would sync her rhythm to the soft impacts of his slightly pudgy belly. More often than not, they climaxed together. That moment was indescribable. When she was just about to peak, he would suddenly thrust harder, his movements becoming rhythmic and deliberate. She would feel a wave of heat within her, her body convulsing uncontrollably, pushing her to the summit of pleasure. Perhaps because of the lubricant of sex and his naturally gentle temperament, they rarely had conflicts. Life went on like this for over a decade until suddenly, he couldn't perform anymore. First came the health issues: hyperthyroidism, hepatitis C, diabetes, and high blood pressure, one after another. Naturally, his sexual performance suffered as well. The first time it happened, he slipped out mid-act. She was at her peak, but he struggled to re-enter, fumbling to push it back in with his hand. She was so close to finishing, but the interruption ruined everything, leaving her deflated. Still, she didn't say anything, afraid to hurt his pride. After a deep breath, she said, "Let's just sleep, honey." But it was an agonizing night. Normally, she could fall asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow, but that night, it took her half an hour to cool her body down. The second time he couldn't perform, she was annoyed but didn't show it. By the third and fourth times, when he consistently failed, she finally couldn't hold back and suggested, "Maybe you should see a doctor?" He was cooperative. They went to see doctors, both traditional Chinese and Western. Nothing worked. Frustrated with himself, he impulsively bought some blue pills. Even with them, he couldn't last. The next day, he was furious, complaining that when the pills weren't needed, they worked just fine. He would get hard at the slightest touch during the day. But when it came to nighttime, when he actually needed them, they were useless. They tried everything, but normal intimacy became impossible. When they could still do it, she had never thought much about how important sex was. It was just an ordinary part of life. But after 6 months, a year without it, she began to understand. She wanted it. She tried to handle it herself, but couldn't figure out how. She secretly bought toys, the kind that sucked, but they hurt. The stick-like ones didn't do anything for her either. She was utterly clueless when it came to self-pleasure. Once, she tried using her fingers, but her nails accidentally scratched herself, leaving her in pain. Moreover, the fact that it was her own hand doing it made it impossible to disassociate. One part of her body knew exactly what the other was doing, and it drained all excitement from the act. She couldn't find that slippery, soul-merging sensation she once had with him. Each attempt left her aroused but unsatisfied, unable to reach the climax she desperately craved. Frustrated, she would give up halfway. Her dried-up body longed for fulfillment. Sometimes she would sleep with her legs clamped around a pillow. Sometimes she would fantasize about attractive men she saw. Other times, she would try to help him manually or orally, attempting things she had once refused to do, hoping to restore their intimacy. But all her efforts were in vain. After 2 years of this, she finally lost patience. She hated him for being unable to perform and hated herself for being so desperate. Why can't I just stop wanting it? Her mind became a battlefield of extremes. One part of her, conservative and proper, despised her own desires. The other, indulgent and bitter, resented him for failing at the most basic duty of a husband. She stopped sparing his feelings. When she was upset, she let it show. She complained when she wanted to complain and argued when she wanted to argue. She knew some things weren't his fault. But if not him, who else was there to blame? Herself? One night, he tried again, initiating intimacy. But again, he failed. She had just begun to feel something when he faltered. Her frustration boiled over, and she nearly kicked him out of bed. In a defeated tone, he said, "Maybe you should just find someone else." Her heart softened for a moment, but as the night wore on, she thought of someone. A man who had been flirting with her for a long time. She had always dismissed him, finding him unworthy. She knew it wasn't entirely flirting. He was just the kind of guy who liked making crude jokes with women. He treated everyone that way. As she slowly dressed, she wondered, should I actually give it a try? Once the idea surfaced, it spiraled out of control. The next time that man flirted with her, she didn't scowl, she smiled. That smile was all it took. The man immediately knew there was a chance. One night, after a few drinks, she half-heartedly resisted before going with him to a hotel. The man was skilled, undeniably so. His stamina was impressive. But strangely, it felt completely different from being with her husband. With him, it felt like an invasion, a show of dominance, a performance. When he entered her, she didn't feel fulfilled, only as if a foreign object had forcefully taken her. After a while, there was some pleasure, and later, she did climax. But the difference was stark. Being with her husband had been a union of body and soul. With this man, it was just a transaction between two bodies. One kind of climax sent waves of excitement from her abdomen to her brain. The other was purely physical. She didn't understand why the difference was so vast. After that night, however, her cravings diminished. It seemed that whether it was a feast of delicacies or plain gruel, it could still satisfy hunger. And that was enough. At least she no longer had to desperately hope her husband would recover. For a while, she and her husband lived a relatively peaceful life. But during that time, she felt deeply wronged. Her lover was married, and whenever his wife called, he would immediately hush her with a finger to his lips, open the window, and stick his head out to answer the phone. "I'm on the street," he'd loudly say. "I'll be home soon. Did you eat yet? Want me to bring you something?" Meanwhile, she lay naked in bed. What the hell is this? She had a family, a child, a career, and yet here she was, dragged around by her libido like a dog, sneaking around in dingy motels to hook up with him. And he was stingy to boot. Sometimes, he'd set a time to meet but wouldn't show up on time, leaving her to check in and wait in the room herself. Her money, of course. If he paid for the room, then he would make sure not to cover the meal. He refused to lose a single cent. She despised him emotionally, but still needed him physically. As for him, he didn't even seem to need her physically that much. She was merely a tool to showcase his virility. Given his circumstances, he couldn't attract an 18-year-old, so he used an older woman like her to prove his charm. That so-called charm repulsed her, but she couldn't walk away from it. The situation made her question herself even more. How pathetic am I that even someone like him treats me this way? She had friends who cheated on their spouses, playing around with reckless abandon, carrying no guilt or shame. She envied them deeply. To them, it was just a game, pure fun. Neither party felt any attachment, and women like her friends treated men purely as objects. She wished she could adopt that mindset, but she simply couldn't. Sometimes, when colleagues whispered, she'd panic, convinced they were gossiping about her. She felt like a stray dog rummaging through garbage, flinching at any raised hand, instinctively cowering as if bracing for a blow. One day, after shopping with friends, she returned home to find her husband in a foul mood. "You're wearing colored contacts?" he asked. She was severely nearsighted with astigmatism. Her prescription lenses included astigmatism correction, but colored contacts couldn't accommodate it. So she rarely wore them. When she did, her vision wasn't as clear. Still, she had worn them before, when she felt like it. Suddenly, she realized her husband, despite allowing her to find someone else, had become paranoid. He scrutinized her every move, even questioning her choice of lenses. No matter if she was out for coffee, shopping, or working late, she had to face his mood when she got home. To him, every late night out was proof she was seeing someone. She was fuming. Her time with her lover was unsatisfying, and at home, she had to bow her head to her husband. Asterisk, did I ask for this? If he could just perform, wouldn't we all be happy? Asterisk. Why did he give her permission to find someone else, only to act like this? She only met her lover once a month at most, yet her husband behaved as if she had a harem of men lining up every day. She felt both bitter and exhausted. Her life seemed like one long series of obligations, forced to marry at a certain age, forced to have a child, forced to develop sexual desires, forced into an affair. Good times never lasted long. Life constantly threw curveballs her way. She ignored her husband's nitpicking and lived defiantly on her terms. But it didn't work. His demands grew incessant. "Where are my slippers? Why didn't you get me a new razor? My shirt's wrinkled. Why didn't you iron it?" She didn't understand. He used to handle these things himself. Why was he suddenly nitpicking? Did he know about her affair? Maybe he did. But wasn't it because of his own failings? Could he even comprehend how much she hated herself now? As the weather cooled one night, she mentioned, "This quilt feels thin." "You're cold," he replied. "I'm not," he added. "Women are always colder. We men don't feel it. Back in the day, I only needed a blanket in winter." She didn't want him to get too hot, so she changed her own quilt to a down one, but left his untouched. When he saw her new quilt, his face darkened. He stomped into the living room to make tea, slamming the lid of the tea box onto the table. She couldn't understand what his problem was. Perhaps a man's psyche crumbles when his body fails. He spent his days slamming plates and breaking bowls, picking fights out of thin air. Am I really doomed to this? She wondered. Her husband couldn't perform, her lover demeaned her self-respect, and in trying to fulfill her needs, she endured double the suffering. That night, they had a massive argument. He, full of righteous indignation, shouted, "What more do you want?" What more could she want? She hated herself for being reduced to someone who just needed to be touched. She hated the humiliation of her affair, the fear of being caught by his wife, the shame of being judged for sleeping with someone so beneath her. She even hated her own desires. Why must humans have sexual needs? If only she had become frigid when he couldn't perform. But no, she was a normal woman. Did he understand the agony of those sleepless nights? He said she could go find someone, but it was just lip service. Did he ever truly forgive her? After all these years, while they might not have been passionately in love, their bond had been deep. Now every conversation spiraled into arguments, their words sharp and bitter. Was this the life she had wanted? The idea of divorce was hers, partly out of spite. He had been unbearable, constantly picking at her every day. So naturally, she retaliated. In the heat of an argument, the words slipped out. Once said, they couldn't be taken back. During the cooling-off period, she felt a pang of regret, but then thought, fine, let's divorce. Who's afraid of whom? After all, life like this truly was unlivable. She didn't know what divorce meant to him. He seemed calm. Maybe it was an act. If he could act, so could she. When the time came, they went to finalize it. As they left the Civil Affairs Bureau, he finally spoke from the heart. It wasn't the lack of intimacy, or the affair that ended us, he said. It's that neither of us adjusted our mindset. Her throat tightened painfully. How she wanted to hold him, to cry in his arms. But 2 years of coldness had estranged their bodies. She bit back her sorrow and said nothing. In that moment, she realized she still loved him. For the rest of her life, she might never again depend on someone with the same deep, intertwined affection, sharing life's burdens together. He wasn't rich, capable, or particularly handsome. But over more than a decade of living together, he had become irreplaceable. She regretted her affair. It had been degrading, a mistake born of desperation. But what was done was done. The harsh words, the provocations, the attacks, they could never be taken back. She pretended to be strong as she said goodbye, making it all seem light and casual. Driving home, her lover sent a WeChat message. Baby, same place. The word baby was worthless to her now. That's just how he was, blunt and to the point when he wanted sex, with never a warm word to accompany it. She deleted him. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't drive. At the next light, she pulled over, buried her face in the steering wheel, and sobbed uncontrollably. A traffic officer knocked on her window, ready to issue a ticket. Without lifting her head or moving her neck, she shifted her eyes, bit by bit, slowly glancing at him. At that moment, she felt like a martyr. Except there was no enemy, only herself, prepared for everything and left with nothing. From now on, she knew her life would be hers alone, to endure and to fight.